Hey guys, this is Mr. Farmer, and these are your notes over the Northwest Ordinance and Shays Rebellion. So, as a quick review of yesterday, we talked about the Articles of Confederation. And the biggest themes that we talked about is that the Articles of Confederation did not work. It had too many weaknesses. The biggest ones being right here. Congress had no power to collect taxes, and they had no power to force states to provide that money or soldiers if they had a need in case of an attack. Other problems would be the government had no executive branch or courts. There was only a legislative branch. So the Articles of Confederation didn't work, and we're going to talk a little bit more right now about why it had to go. Before we get to that, around the same time that all this was going on, people were starting to move west into this area, which back then this would be the northwest part of our country. The Treaty of Paris after the Revolutionary War had made the Mississippi River right here the western border of the United States. So this was the northwest part of America. Now today the northwest part of America would be Washington or Oregon, or even further would be Alaska. But back then this was the northwest part of our country right here. So they decided to create a document to organize this territory. Settlers were starting to go here after the Revolutionary War, and they needed to organize it. They used to not be allowed to go here due to the proclamation of 1763, but now they could. People were crossing the Appalachian Mountains, so they passed a law, and that law was called the Northwest Ordinance. Ordinance is just another fancy way of saying law. So the Northwest Ordinance did 5 things. The first thing it did was it created the Northwest Territory, which is this territory right here that eventually 5 states would come out of, Ohio being the first. The second thing it did is it created a system for bringing new states into the Union. It was a very detailed, laid out system. You had to have 60,000 people, then you had to draw up a state constitution, then you had to elect a governor, and then you had to fill out an application. There was a lot more details and steps than that, but that's a quick summary. And once you had gone through that process, you could apply and be approved to become a state. So never before did we have this official system for becoming a state, making that transition from a territory to a state. So the Northwest Ordinance made that system. The third thing it did is it had a Bill of Rights. Now this is not the Bill of Rights, which you may have heard of, which was added onto our Constitution in 1791. This is just a Bill of Rights if you live in this territory. And that was a way of encouraging settlers to move into this Northwest Territory, was guaranteeing them a certain number of rights. The Spanish were to the west of us, and the British were up in Canada. So they wanted explorers and settlers to fill these new areas. So they were trying to encourage people to move here. So it had a Bill of Rights. The fourth thing was it provided for free public education. So part of the Northwest Ordinance said if you moved to one of these 5 states, you were guaranteed a free public education, which wasn't the case everywhere in the United States at the time. So that was another incentive to get people to move here. And the last thing, and one of the most significant, is it also had a 5th part which said in the Northwest Territory, these 5 states, it said there was going to be no slavery. So it banned slavery in the Northwest Territory. Now that is significant because this is the first time which essentially they are saying the Ohio River is the boundary for slavery. So above this river, slavery was illegal. Below it, slavery was legal. Now, if you fast forward to the Civil War, This is the boundary between slave states and free states. It's why the crossing point on the Underground Railroad was the Ohio River. It's why we have the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center here in Cincinnati, right here. It all goes back to this Northwest Ordinance making this line, the Ohio River, the border, and banning slavery here in the Northwest Territory. All right. Next point. So here's the Northwest Territory. You can see Ohio was the first state in 1803, and eventually more states came out of that: Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and just a little part of Minnesota up here. It was pretty much 5 states, just a little part of Minnesota. All right, next is Shays' Rebellion. So I'm going to kind of tell you the story, and then I'll put it up here. So essentially what happened was, after the Revolutionary War, the state of Massachusetts had a lot of debt from paying soldiers and just the costs of war. So what they did is they started taxing the people of Massachusetts. Well, some of these poor farmers could not afford these taxes. They couldn't afford these taxes, and they were mad. They had just fought this Revolutionary War to avoid paying high taxes, and now here their own government is paying them, making them pay these high taxes. So eventually some of these farmers that couldn't pay their taxes had their farms foreclosed and taken from them. So they rebelled. A bunch of farmers rebelled, and they were led by a guy named Daniel Shays. So that's why it's called Shays' Rebellion. So Daniel Shays led a group of angry farmers, and they stormed there's a little town in Massachusetts called Springfield, and they stormed the arsenal there. The arsenal is where they stored all the weapons, and they stormed the courts. They shut down the courts, and they captured this arsenal where all these weapons were. And this rebellion goes on, and the state of Massachusetts asked the federal government for help. So the federal government sends out a request to the surrounding states. They said, we need help. There's this big rebellion going on in Massachusetts. It's going on, and we can't stop it. Well, under the Articles of Confederation, states could say no. And that's what they did. The surrounding states said, well, that's Massachusetts' problem, not ours. They can deal with it. So this rebellion just goes on. And what it did is it really revealed a weakness under the Articles of Confederation. The national government could ask states for money and troops, but it could not force them like today. Today we could have a draft. Today there are federal taxes. So the federal government can force states to provide money and troops, but back then they could not. So this rebellion went on. Eventually it was stopped. George Washington brought in some militiamen. They were eventually able to bring in enough of the militia from Massachusetts, and they were able to stop this rebellion. But the importance of it is it showed a demand for a stronger central government. It revealed a weakness. People thought to themselves, if we can't stop a rebellion of some farmers, what are we going to do if another country attacks us? Then we'd be in real trouble. So they were mad about high taxes, farm closings, and being thrown in prison for debts. But the importance right here, it showed a demand for a stronger central government. It revealed a weakness. Again, if we could not stop a rebellion of a bunch of farmers, what were we going to do if another country attacked us? We needed a stronger central government. Okay, that's it, guys. Put this paper in your notes section.